Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon to you all, from those down the road to the folks around the world. Welcome back to another Wednesday weekly video. It's the beginning of the month, and you know what that means? I'm going to be doing another one of my series of shorts videos. These 4 to 5 minute brief yet detailed topical discussions, should we call them, based around the most influential and topical things that have been going on in the past month. If you would like to skip ahead or just watch one of these particular shorts or just a couple, then the topics as well as their timestamps will be in the description below. So without further ado, before I go on any longer, I'm actually going to get on with those 4 to 5 minutes topics. Time is ticking. Now I first want to talk about a region known as the Tigray in northern Ethiopia. Ethiopia is this little red patch here, and the Tigray is just this little bit where the tip of my finger is. Its capital city is the city of Mekelle. I'll put a spelling of that just down here. The Tigray has about 6 million inhabitants, covering a 50,000 square kilometre plot of land, making it the 5th densest populated of the 9 regions that make up the country of Ethiopia. Now, as you can see, Ethiopia here, the Tigray just up to the north, you have the country of Eritrea in this little yellow patch here, quite a small country to its north, and then to the west, you have the Sudan. Now, the Tigray has its own language and ethnic community known as the Tigrania. Now, Ethiopia is a country where there are numerous different ethnic communities, not just the Tigray, and they in turn have created their own political parties that have banded together to create the modern day Ethiopia that was formed in 1991. But it is interesting to note from what I'm about to present to you that the Tigray has been sort of the standout role in all of this, and even before the country was formed in 1991, the Tigray People's Liberation Movement, or Front, as it is called, was incredibly influential in resisting the powers that be between 1975 when it was formed, and obviously when the modern day Ethiopia was formed in 1991. Now, putting aside my little globe and going back in time, Ethiopia was once part of a wider empire, its own empire, created in 1250 by the Solomonic dynasty, or the Solomon dynasty. Then you come to the carve-up of Africa, this little period between the late 19th and the early 20th century. Now, up until that point, Africa had been, well, in relative peace and under its own sort of influence. Then you had the carve-up of Africa. The British managed to take control of the Sudan, parts of Kenya, as well as the Somaliland. But the Ethiopian Empire, at this point known as the Abyssinia, resisted attempts at occupation. Even in 1883, when the Italian imperialists took control of Eritrea, which was part of the Abyssinia and the Ethiopian Empire, the main body of the Ethiopian Empire resisted attempts at occupation. That was until 1936, when the defences finally broke down and the Italians managed to gain the upper hand and occupy the Ethiopian Empire, or the region of Ethiopia. Then you get to the Second World War. The Italians were defeated with the help of the British and the local Abyssinian people. The Ethiopian Empire remained intact until 1974, and at this point, this is the part of the Cold War, there were a sort of almost another carve-up of Africa, shall we say, where countries that were becoming newly independent were trying to be influenced by either the Soviets and the communists, or from capitalist and democratic countries such as America. So in 1974, a group known as the Derg, a Soviet-backed group of Marxists-Leninists, took control of the country, abolished the monarchy, and and started a civil war within Ethiopia, created the Derg, which as a country, as its party and country, started a civil war and led to the formation of a number of democratic political parties, one including the Tigray People's Liberation Front, which was created in 1975. The Derg were eventually ousted as political leaders in 1987, following a massive economic downturn and the notorious and infamous famine of 1983 and 85, which caught the eye or the attention of the world, creating movements and charitable events such as Live Aid and Band Aid. So in 1987, the Derg were ousted, and in its place was replaced with an equally Marxist-Leninist political group, but this only lasted until 1991. Now that was because the Tigray People's Liberation Front, as well as a number of different political parties within Ethiopia, hold on a moment, and that includes the Oromo Democratic Party and the South Ethiopian People's Democratic Movement, created an alliance, a political alliance known as the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, which is a party that up until 2019 was still in existence. Now, with this political alliance, this dictatorship that had been formed in 1987 was ousted by 1991, thus ending the civil war in Ethiopia. Unfortunately, when you get to December of 2019, a few more political parties that were formed over this new democratic Ethiopia were being brought into the fold of this political alliance. And the Tigray People's Liberation Front, that's a mouthful in itself, decided that they didn't want to be part of this group, which rebranded itself as the People's Choice. The People's Choice became the ruling party or the ruling alliance within the Ethiopian government, and had postponed their local elections until 2021. They were due to come out in 2020, but because of this virus crisis, the government in Ethiopia just decided to postpone them. The Tigray local government, however, in September 2020 decided to hold their own little local elections, but the Ethiopian government declared them an illegal election and made them null and void. And this is what started this little conflict. Well, I say little conflict, there are hundreds of people that have been killed and thousands that have been displaced. And up until recently, the government had taken control of that capital city, Mekele, and had declared themselves victorious. But the Tigray movement, the Tigray Front, is still declaring itself as a resistance movement that like it had been back in the 70s and the 1980s. President Trump is a lame duck. Now, that's not me just being rude about the man. That is the official terminology to call an outgoing president who is waiting for his successor to drive through the gates of the White House, walk through the Rose Garden, and sit within the Oval Office, thereby becoming and officially sitting as the incumbent president. So, President Trump is waiting to be removed from the White House, or to leave the White House, and therefore is called a lame duck. Now, a transition period between presidents has always been there, right back from the very beginning with George Washington and his successors. But in the last 100 years or so, there have been changes made to the Constitution, to certain acts within American law that have refined and defined what a transition period should look like. In 1932 to 33, the transition period between Henry Hoover and Franklin Delano Roosevelt was underway. Roosevelt had won the election and was waiting for his March 4th start date, because that was what the inauguration date used to be right up until that point. Now, the two presidents had a very contentious relationship. They were very argumentative with one another. And this potentially is likely to be one of the reasons why the Depression within America got worse. Roosevelt wanted Hoover, in a last final act, to plug millions of dollars into loans and into bank schemes, but Hoover just refused. So when Roosevelt came into the presidency in 1933, obviously, if you look back at my Great Depression video, my potted history on it, he created this great deal. And in 1933 also, he decided to create the 20th Amendment, which shortened the time frame of transition. Instead of up till March, it would be up to January the 20th or January the 21st. And in a crisis, you need a short transition period so that you can get things going and get the ball rolling as soon as possible, which is kind of what we are facing right now, or what the Americans are facing right now. I live in the UK. Because President Biden needs a short transition period so that he can come in and he can get the ball rolling and solve the crisis that is facing in America on all fronts. Another sort of step towards refining and defining the transition period comes with the Transition Act of 1963. Now, this is just sort of the logistical know-how and the logistical definition of a transition period. Who you're going to bring into your team, into your chief of staff, into your press team, who's going to be your defense guy. All these different secretaries need to be decided within that transition period, and that 1963 Act is what that defines. It also has a number of extra clauses about what should happen, or what sort of a transition period would be like when a president dies, or when a president is removed from office, or perhaps he just resigns. And fortuitously, in 1963, John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and this form of transition period was put into use. So this clause was integral to that particular transition period between President Kennedy's assassination and Johnson. Oh, almost forgot that. Lyndon B. Johnson's inauguration, or in involving himself as the president as of 1964. One of the most sort of similar looking transition periods from today to years ago would probably be the Clinton-Bush transition period of 2000 to 2001. Because of the recount of votes within the state of Florida, a story of which I included in last month's series of shorts, this recount in Florida in 2000 meant that Bush had an even shorter time period in which to transition and become the President of America, and to sort out his staff, thanks to that 1963 Act. Now let's move on to probably the most important story of the month, if not the year, and that is a vaccine for this horrible virus that we have been going through over the past few months, that has restricted our social interaction that we have so desperately been wanting and trying to have for so long. This vaccine will help millions, if not billions, of people return to some sense of normality. Now, this term vaccine comes from the Latin phrase variole vaccine, which means smallpox of the cow. Now, this is because Edward Jenner, a man working in 1798, coined this term for his immunization and inoculation of the smallpox disease in children. He discovered that by taking a small piece of the cowpox disease, you could inject it into a small child and they would likely be immune to this disease. And thanks to Jenner's discovery, the World Health Organization back in the 1980s declared smallpox an eradicated disease. And in fact, in 1934, the UK was one of the first countries to eradicate smallpox in general. Smallpox was a very prevalent disease back in the 18th century, the late 18th century, when Edward Jenner was working. 1 in 13 Londoners would catch the smallpox virus and would likely die. But if they did survive, then they would be left with terrible scarring for the rest of their lives. Now, there was a lack of understanding about how diseases really worked. And over the 19th century, when bacteriology and microbiology became fields of study and understood better, and actually pretty much discovered, that's when you get to the point in the 1880s where Louis Pasteur decides to honour Edward Jenner's work by creating the vaccine term, an all-encompassing word to mean the immunisation of people from infectious diseases. Louis Pasteur was famous in his own right for being a microbiologist, a biologist, and a chemist, and for creating the scientific procedure of pasteurization, but also creating vaccines for diseases like rabies, for anthrax, and for cholera. These are all diseases that have changed people's lives, and the vaccine itself has changed even more lives, to the point where only a small handful of cases of each of these diseases are noted or are prevalent in today's society. And even furthering on from that, by the time you get to the 1950s and 1960s, there are even more vaccines to be discovered and to be created, and even more impetus to vaccinate children, vaccinate individuals from these diseases. There are vaccines for polio, which recently became an eradicated disease throughout the whole of Africa, one of the last sort of continents of the world where polio was still prevalent. Vaccines for measles, mumps, rubella, the MMR jab. All these different little things that have made such difference to people's lives. But there are obviously people that don't agree with vaccines or are a bit nervous about vaccines, or the thought of getting an injection because they are afraid of needles. I'm not particularly keen on needles myself. But the trends in which we vaccinate people now are slowly changing, or are being tested to see whether or not people can vaccinate by other means. Perhaps one could vaccinate through an aerosol. Perhaps one could vaccinate through ingesting a genetically altered plant to give you that same vaccinating properties, but also in a much obviously nicer way, instead of the age-old jab. And of course, as different diseases are affecting different age groups, like with this virus in 2020, that is, more impetus in vaccinating older generations and older people who are most vulnerable. So while vaccines are brilliant and they have changed the world immensely and created a world in which we are free of some of the most awful diseases, not all of them, I'm not saying that we're all perfect, but there's always a step to be made. There's always something new to discover, and always a better way of helping people. And that's what scientists, that's what doctors, and that's what everybody wants to do. They just want to help people, and they just want people to live happy, healthy lives without the fear or the threat of an infectious disease. Well, I certainly hope that you have enjoyed this video. I hope that you have come to understand a little bit more about some of the most topical and influential stories that have been going on over the past month. If you like this video, please hit that little thumbs up button. Subscribe to the channel, because that makes all the difference, and I would really appreciate it if you did. If you have anything you'd like to comment about, maybe I might have missed something, or I might have got something slightly wrong, please do comment below. And until next week, I will see you on. Links for my socials in the description below as well. See you later.